Abigail Whitmore did not cry when she discovered the truth. She folded the letter, pressed it flat against her palm, and walked downstairs to dress for dinner alone, as she had done for months. Her husband's chair sat empty. Her child moved inside her. And somewhere across Charleston, Nathaniel Caldwell was pouring wine for another woman. That night, Abigail made a decision. Not out of rage, not out of heartbreak. Out of something quieter and far more dangerous. Dignity. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 came to Charleston like it always did, heavy, close, and unforgiving. The kind of heat that pressed against a woman's chest and made breathing feel like labor. But Abigail Whitmore Caldwell had learned in the 4 years of her marriage that discomfort was simply the texture of her life. She had stopped naming it. She simply endured it. She had dressed carefully that evening. Not for her husband. Nathaniel had made clear 3 weeks prior that he would not be attending the Hargrove summer banquet. Too many obligations, he'd said, his eyes already sliding past her toward the window. She had nodded. She had not asked which obligations. She already knew. She dressed for herself. The gown was pale gold, the color of early morning light, fitted close at the waist to show the modest swell of her pregnancy 5 months now. Though most of Charleston society still spoke of it in the careful circling language they used for everything they found inconvenient. A Caldwell heir. Nathaniel had acknowledged the pregnancy with a single nod and the promise of a larger household allowance. He had not touched her since. Her maid Ruth fastened the last button at the back of Abigail's gown and stepped back. "You look beautiful, ma'am," Ruth said quietly. "I look presentable," Abigail replied. She picked up her gloves from the vanity table. "That will do." Ruth hesitated. The girl was 17, new to the household, and she had the habit of saying what she felt before she thought to stop herself. "Will Mr. Caldwell be joining you, ma'am?" Abigail smoothed her right glove over her fingers, one careful press at a time. "No," she said. "He will not." She did not say more. Ruth did not ask more. That was the agreement that lived unspoken between every woman of quality and every woman who served her. They both understood certain things, and both understood that naming them aloud changed nothing. The Hargrove banquet was held at the Thomas Hargrove estate on the north end of the city, a house that managed to be enormous and still feel cramped when filled with Charleston's upper tier. Oil lamps lined the long drive. Carriages crowded the circular entry. The sound of a string quartet drifted through the open windows into the warm evening air. Abigail descended from her carriage unassisted. She had learned that too, how to step down from a carriage with grace when no one was there to offer a hand. You kept your back straight. You placed your weight deliberately. You looked straight ahead, not at the footmen who pretended not to notice, not at the women near the entry who clocked her arrival with practiced disinterest. She walked in alone. Mrs. Hargrove, a sharp-eyed woman of 50, who missed very little, met her at the entrance of the main hall, with a warmth that cost her something. "Mrs. Caldwell." She took Abigail's hands. "We are so glad you came, and looking radiant, I must say." "You're very kind," Abigail said. "Nathaniel not with you this evening. A prior commitment," Abigail said smoothly. She had learned to say it that way, not an apology, not an explanation. A statement, a fact, one that closed the door on further inquiry. Mrs. Hargrove held her gaze a moment too long. There was no pity in the look. Pity would have been easier to dismiss. It was something more careful than pity. Recognition, perhaps. The look of a woman who had once stood in a similar hall beside a similar empty space and learned to hold herself just so. "Come," Mrs. Hargrove said. "Let me introduce you to some people worth knowing." The hall was arranged around 6 long tables, each seating 12, with smaller groupings near the windows, where guests gathered before taking their seats. Abigail accepted a glass of lemonade, no wine not in her condition, and allowed herself to be introduced and reintroduced to the usual parade of Charleston's respectable families. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Her father, a merchant of moderate success and considerable intelligence, had raised her to read rooms the way other men read ledgers, quickly, accurately, and without sentiment clouding the figures. She had married Nathaniel Caldwell with that same pragmatic eye. The Caldwell name was old and substantial. The Caldwell fortune was real. And Nathaniel himself, at 29, had struck her as a man with the potential to become genuinely good if someone took the time to show him how. She had been wrong about the last part, not about his intelligence, not about his capability, but about his willingness to be shaped by someone he had already decided was lesser than himself. She was moving toward the far window, seeking a moment's quiet, before dinner was called, when she heard the laugh. She knew it before she turned. She had heard that laugh across parlor rooms and carriage yards and the back entrance of their own home at 2 a.m. She had heard it and chosen each time not to let herself respond to it. Tonight she turned. Across the room, across the full width of the Hargrove Hall, past 3 clusters of guests and a table of flowers that smelled of orange blossom. Nathaniel Caldwell stood near the east wall. He was not alone. The woman beside him was named Catherine Voss. Abigail had known for 11 months. Catherine was the widow of a Savannah merchant, dark-haired and well-dressed, and she laughed at everything Nathaniel said, with the particular delight of a woman who had decided he was worth impressing. Nathaniel had his hand on the small of her back. He was leaning close, saying something near her ear. Catherine's chin tilted upward, amused, entertained, wholly engaged. Abigail's grip tightened around her glass. Not from anger, from something colder and more precise, the sudden absolute clarity that comes when something you have half known for a long time reveals itself completely. The last doubt evaporating. The last small foolish hope folding away like a piece of paper slipped into a fire. He had told her he was not attending. He was here, with her, at the same banquet, the same hall. 40 feet from his pregnant wife, in the same room as half of Charleston's established society, with his hand on another woman's back. Abigail turned away. She turned deliberately and completely, the way you close a book whose ending you already know. She straightened her shoulders. She took a slow breath. She looked at the window, at the dark garden beyond it, at the tiny orange flames of the outdoor torches. She did not cry. She had made a decision some months back that she would not cry in public over Nathaniel Caldwell. She would not give him that. She would not give any of them that. Mrs. Caldwell. The voice came from her left, and it was low and quiet enough that she was not startled. It seemed to arrive with a kind of intention, as though the man attached to it had chosen his moment carefully. She turned. He was taller than most men in the room, with a broad, unhurried quality about him, the kind of physical stillness that in other men read as arrogance, but in this man read simply as someone who did not feel the need to perform anything. His coat was well made but not showy. His face was weathered in a way that suggested time outdoors rather than society drawing rooms. He looked to be somewhere past 40, perhaps 45, with dark hair threaded through with early gray at the temples. He removed his hat slightly and held it at his side, a small, genuine gesture, not the practiced half-bow of a man working a room. "Forgive me for approaching without introduction," he said. "Samuel Harrington. I believe we've not met." "We have not," Abigail said. "Abigail Caldwell." Something in his expression shifted only slightly, only for a moment. "Thomas Hargrove's wife mentioned you might be here. She said you had a particular interest in land management." He paused. "I hope that's not an awkward way to begin a conversation." "It's a better way than most," Abigail said honestly. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something short of it. "Hargrove tells me your husband has holdings in rice and cotton across the Low Country." "He does. And you manage the household accounts." "I manage considerably more than the household accounts," she said. Not sharply, simply accurately. "My husband is often occupied with other business. The land management decisions are largely mine." Samuel Harrington looked at her steadily, not with the evaluating look of a man who was deciding whether to believe her, with the look of a man who simply did. "Then you may be the person I should actually be speaking with," he said. Damn. They found seats near the window before the formal dinner was called, and Abigail discovered with the particular surprise of something long absent, suddenly returned, that the conversation was good. Not politely good, not socially functional. Actually good, the kind of conversation where both people are genuinely interested in what the other is saying, where the pauses aren't awkward, but simply thinking, where one idea leads naturally into the next without anyone performing expertise they don't have. Samuel Harrington had recently acquired a parcel of land in the backcountry, 3 days' ride from Charleston, and was navigating the combined difficulty of uncertain soil surveys and inconsistent labor agreements. He spoke about it directly, no posturing, no false confidence, and he asked her questions that were specific, which told her he was not humoring her. "The survey issue is the more urgent problem," Abigail said. "If the eastern boundary is unclear, any lease agreement you enter is built on a contested foundation. You'd need to resolve title before you can do anything else with confidence." "That's what my attorney tells me," he said. "He also tells me it will take the better part of 2 years. "It might," Abigail said, "unless you can establish a prior agreement with the adjacent landowner, a preliminary boundary acknowledgement. It's not a legal resolution, but it provides a working basis that most judges will respect when the formal survey is complete." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "That's not what my attorney suggested." "Your attorney is likely more concerned with being correct than being useful," she said. Then, catching herself, "Forgive me. That was presumptuous." "It was accurate," he said. "Please continue being presumptuous." She almost smiled. Almost. The unfamiliarity of it surprised her, the sheer novelty of a man asking her to continue speaking. She continued. She had not been watching the room. She had allowed herself for the first time in months to simply be in a conversation, and she had not been watching. So she did not see the moment Nathaniel noticed her, but she felt it. There is a particular sensation women who have been in difficult marriages know it well of being watched by someone who is not there for you. Not the warm weight of affectionate attention, but something with an edge to it. Assessment. Recalibration. The gaze of someone who has suddenly become uncertain about the arithmetic they thought they'd already solved. She became aware of it slowly, the way you become aware of a change in air pressure before a storm. And when she finally turned her head just slightly, not enough to be obvious, she saw Nathaniel across the room. He was no longer near the east wall. He was standing with a small group of men near the center of the hall, a glass in one hand. But he was not talking to the group. He was looking at her. At their table. At her and Samuel Harrington, deep in conversation, her expression animated. Her hands moving as she made a point about survey law, and his expression. Samuel's attentive and engaged and entirely certain that what she was saying was worth listening to. Nathaniel's face was very still. She looked away first. Not from discomfort. She looked away because she was not finished making her point, and the point was more interesting to her than whatever was happening behind his eyes. "If you engage the adjacent owner directly," she continued, "before the attorneys make it adversarial, you have a far better chance of Mrs. Caldwell." The voice came from behind her. Low. Controlled. The particular controlled quality of a man who was not feeling controlled. She turned. Nathaniel stood 2 steps back from the table. His glass was still in his hand. His expression was arranged into something that resembled pleasantness, but the pleasantness was thin, a layer of paint over something that was working very hard underneath. "I wasn't aware you were attending," he said. "You weren't here when I left," she replied pleasantly. A beat. The kind that lands like a stone dropping into water. Samuel Harrington had risen to his feet when Nathaniel approached quietly without comment, simply the instinct of a man with manners. He stood now at a respectful distance, unhurried. "Harrington," Nathaniel said, turning to him with the thin pleasantness still in place. "I didn't know you were in Charleston." "Just passing through," Samuel said. There was nothing particular in his tone. No challenge, no warmth, no invitation. Just a man responding to what was said to him. "Your wife has been generous with her time. She knows more about backcountry survey law than anyone I've spoken with in 3 months." Another beat. Nathaniel looked at Abigail. She kept her expression quiet and met his eyes without tension. "Abigail is very capable," Nathaniel said, in the specific tone of a man saying something he believes sounds like a compliment. "Yes," Samuel said simply. "She is." Dinner was called. They moved to the tables with the rest of the company. Nathaniel materialized at Abigail's side in the reshuffle of seating, and she did not comment on it, and he did not explain it. Catherine Voss found herself seated at the far end of the hall in the company of people who were perfectly respectable, but not the people she had been standing with an hour ago. Nathaniel held Abigail's chair for her. The first time in 8 months. She sat without thanking him for it, not from spite, simply because to thank him would have required acknowledging that it was unusual, and she had decided somewhere between the window and the table that she was finished marking the distance between how things were and how they should have been. The dinner progressed. Nathaniel spoke to the table to the men on either side with the easy authority of a man who is accustomed to being listened to. Abigail ate carefully and spoke when addressed, and felt the strange doubling sensation she'd grown familiar with over the past year, the simultaneous experience of being in a room and somewhere slightly outside of it, watching the room from a slight remove, noting what was said and what was meant, and how much distance existed between the two. Nathaniel put his hand on hers twice during the meal. The first time she did not move. The second time she picked up her fork. He withdrew his hand. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. After dinner, when the tables broke and the company moved toward the garden for the evening air, Nathaniel came to her directly. "I need to speak with you," he said. She looked at him. 4 years of marriage. She could read his face the way you read a house you've lived in, every creak and draft familiar, every dark corner mapped. He was not angry. He was something more complicated than angry. He was unsettled. Nathaniel Caldwell, who was never unsettled, who had the particular confidence of a man who had never seriously had cause to doubt himself, was unsettled. She had not intended it. She had not gone to the banquet to produce this effect. She had simply gone, and Samuel Harrington had simply talked to her, and Nathaniel had simply seen it. And something in the arithmetic he had long taken for granted had shifted. "We can speak at home," she said. "I'd rather, at home, Nathaniel." He looked at her. She looked back. The firmness in her voice was not a performance. It was simply where she had arrived after 11 months of gathering herself back from the edges of what he had done to her. A quiet kind of bedrock. The thing that was left when you stripped away everything else. He nodded once. She turned back to the garden and the company within it. Samuel Harrington was near the stone balustrade in conversation with Thomas Hargrove. He caught her eye as she passed and inclined his head a small, respectful acknowledgement. Nothing more. She inclined her own head in return. The carriage home was silent. Nathaniel sat across from her in the narrow dark. He was not looking out the window. He was looking at his hands, or at the floor, or at something that existed only in his own accounting of the evening. Abigail rested her hand against the curve of her pregnancy and felt the small answering movement within her, the particular flicker of a child not yet in the world, entirely unaware of the particular complications that awaited it there. She thought about what Samuel Harrington had said. Not the words specifically, but the quality underneath the words, the simple, steady assumption that what she said was worth hearing. The absence of effort. The way he had risen from his chair when Nathaniel approached, not with deference, not with challenge, simply with the manners of a man who had no reason to be less than what he was. She thought about the look on Nathaniel's face, not with satisfaction. She had never wanted to wound him. She had wanted for 4 years to be known by him, to have him look at her the way Samuel Harrington had looked at her over a conversation about survey law with the plain, uncomplicated attention of someone who was genuinely there. She had wanted to matter to the man she had married, but she had learned something tonight, something she had been circling for months without being willing to look at it directly. There is a difference between a man who has failed to see you and a man who will always fail to see you. And the only way to know which you are married to is to wait, to hold yourself very still. And wait, and see what happens when someone else does. Tonight, Nathaniel Caldwell had seen his wife for the first time in years. The question that would determine everything that followed, was not what he had felt when he saw her. It was what he would do about it. Chay. The carriage stopped. The house was quiet when they entered. The servants had left a single lamp burning in the front hall. Abigail moved toward the stairs. Abigail. She stopped. She didn't turn immediately. She took one breath, steady and deliberate. And then she turned. Nathaniel stood in the center of the hall, his coat still on his hat in his hand. He looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived somewhere unexpected and was not entirely sure how to account for the journey. "How long?" he said. He stopped, restarted. "How long has Harrington been in Charleston?" She looked at him for a moment. "Is that what you want to ask me?" she said. He didn't answer. "Because," she continued, her voice even, "if that is what you want to ask me, if the question you brought home from that hall tonight is how long Samuel Harrington has been in Charleston, then I think we are going to have a very short conversation." Nathaniel's jaw shifted. The muscle in his cheek moved. "I saw you," he said. "The two of you. You were—" "We were talking," she said, "about land surveys." She let that sit. He had questions. I had answers. That is the full extent of what you saw. "You were animated," he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, a hairline thing just enough to let something through. You were laughing." "Yes," she said. "I was." The word fell between them like a stone. Nathaniel's eyes moved over her face with the particular desperate quality of a man who has just now, only now, begun to understand the shape of something he has been destroying for a very long time. "Abigail." "It's late," she said. "I'm tired. We will speak tomorrow if you have something to say." She turned to the stairs. "I didn't know you'd be there tonight," he said to her back. His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. She stopped, one step up from the hall floor. "I know," she said. And the two words carried something that was not forgiveness and not condemnation, something more accurate than either. An accounting, a plain statement of the record. He hadn't known she would be there because he had never in 4 years of marriage wondered where she was. He had never considered that she might be somewhere in a room being known by someone, that she might walk into a hall and a man might rise from his chair and ask her to continue speaking and mean it. He had never considered that she might exist fully and completely in the spaces where he wasn't looking, until tonight. Until 40 feet of distance and a handful of laughter and a man from the backcountry with practical questions about survey law had turned Nathaniel Caldwell around to face the most fundamental failure of his adult life. Abigail climbed the stairs without looking back. Behind her, she heard no movement, no footstep, no sound at all. Just the silence of a man standing in his own front hall, alone with what he finally understood. She did not sleep easily that night, but she slept. The child moved twice before dawn, small certain rolls. The body already its own thing, already with its own agenda. Abigail lay in the half-dark and breathed and thought about what it meant to carry something forward, what it took, what it cost. She thought about her father's voice years ago in the counting house on Church Street. "A fair accounting never requires anger, Abigail. It simply requires accuracy." He had been talking about ledgers. He had been talking about everything. She had been keeping the fair accounting for years now. Every absence, every dismissal, every evening she had dressed herself and sat at a dinner table and answered for a man who was not there. Every time she had heard Catherine Voss's laugh echoing in the wrong hours. Every time she had placed her hand on her own growing belly and understood that she was going to raise this child with or without its father's participation, and that the question was simply which it would be. She had not gone to the Hargrove banquet to force a reckoning, but she understood in the honest dark of her bedroom that a reckoning had come regardless. And she understood something else too. She was not afraid of it. That was the thing she had not expected. not the anger which had been a faithful companion for 11 months, and not the grief which had arrived in waves she had learned to ride. But this, the absence of fear. The solid, steady, utterly undramatic realization that she knew who she was. That she had always known who she was, and that no amount of being unseen had actually made her invisible. She had simply been invisible to the wrong person. Samuel Harrington had looked at her across a table and heard what she said and asked her to keep talking. It was a small thing. It was the smallest thing in the world, and she recognized with a clarity that was almost physical that it had lit something in her that she had thought was out, not extinguished, not destroyed, just banked low and waiting. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. And Nathaniel Caldwell, standing in his own front hall in the silence after she climbed the stairs, had finally tonight, at last perhaps too late, begun to understand what he had spent 4 years failing to see. The summer pressed against the window. The house was quiet. Abigail Caldwell closed her eyes. Whatever came next would come in the morning. She would be ready for it. Nathaniel did not sleep. Abigail knew this not because she heard him. The house was large enough that his restlessness did not reach her, but because she knew the particular weight of a man carrying something he had no practice carrying. She had watched him for 4 years. She knew how he moved when he was certain, which was most of the time. And she knew in the way that long acquaintance teaches a woman things she would sometimes rather not know, that last night had stripped that certainty from him in a way that nothing else in his life ever had. She rose before the household stirred. She dressed herself. Ruth would not be up for another hour, and went downstairs to the small room off the back of the kitchen that she had quietly converted over the past 18 months into something that more closely resembled an office than the sitting room Nathaniel believed she used. There was a desk there, a proper one, not the decorative writing table in the parlor, but a working desk with a surface large enough for ledgers and correspondence, and the survey maps she had requested from the county office 3 months ago, when she had begun to suspect that the overseer on the Caldwell Low Country property was misreporting the harvest weights. She had not told Nathaniel about that suspicion. She had gathered the evidence herself carefully and without drama, because she had learned that drama accomplished nothing that accuracy could not accomplish better. She sat at the desk and opened the top ledger and worked for 2 hours in the quiet of the early morning, and when Ruth finally appeared at the door with a tray of bread and tea, Abigail had already drafted 2 letters and identified a discrepancy in the summer accounts that was going to require a direct conversation with their factor in Georgetown. "Good morning, ma'am," Ruth said, setting the tray on the corner of the desk. "Morning, Ruth." Abigail set down her pen. "Is Mr. Caldwell downstairs?" Ruth hesitated in that particular way she had the barely there pause of a girl trying to decide how much of what she knew she was permitted to share. "He was in the study when I came through, ma'am. He didn't ask for breakfast." "Set a tray for him anyway," Abigail said. "Leave it outside the door." "Yes, ma'am." Ruth left. Abigail drank her tea and looked at the letter she'd half-drafted to the Georgetown factor and thought about Nathaniel sitting in his study in the early morning without asking for breakfast, which was something he had never in 4 years failed to do. She was not moved by it. That was what surprised her most. Not the absence of softness in her, but its replacement by something she could only describe as clarity. A woman who is softened by a man's first sign of distress after years of being the one to suffer it has confused sympathy for wisdom. Abigail Whitmore had been raised by a man who believed in accurate accounting. She was conducting one now. She finished her tea, sealed the letter to the factor, and went to dress for the day. Chapter 10. Nathaniel came to her in the front parlor at 10:30. She was reviewing the household order for the week flower candles, 2 yards of linen for the nursery, which she had been quietly preparing without ceremony, because ceremony required a partner, and she had learned not to wait for one. She heard him, before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his step, which was purposeful even when he was uncertain, because Nathaniel Caldwell had not learned the difference between moving with direction and moving with confidence. He moved always as though he had somewhere to be. Sometimes he did. Sometimes it was simply all he knew. He stopped in the doorway. She continued with the order sheet. "Abigail, "I'm listening," she said. A pause. He came into the room. She heard him take the chair across from her, the scrape of it against the floor, the small creak of his weight settling. "I want to explain about last night," he said. "You were at the Hargrove banquet," she said without looking up. "When you had told me you would not be attending." "I know. With Catherine Voss." Silence. She set down the order sheet. She looked at him. He looked like a man who had spent the night with something he couldn't put down, the particular hollowness around the eyes, the jaw held carefully, the posture that wanted to be straight but cost him something to maintain. "How long?" she said quietly. "Did you expect me not to know?" Nathaniel's hands moved a brief involuntary gesture, the nearest thing to flinching she had ever seen from him. I wasn't. "I have known about Catherine Voss since last October," she said. "I have known for 11 months. I have known the name of the house on Lagar Street where you meet her the days of the week you prefer, and the fact that her late husband left her comfortable enough that she requires nothing from you except what you are apparently very willing to give." The color had gone from Nathaniel's face. "Abigail, I am not telling you this to wound you," she said, and she meant it. Her voice was level in a way that was not coldness. Cold was what Nathaniel had mistaken it for these past months, the quiet self-possession that he had taken for indifference because he had never bothered to understand the difference. "I am telling you because if you intend to have a conversation with me about last night, I need you to have it accurately, not with the understanding that you have successfully hidden something, with the understanding that you have not." Nathaniel stared at her. In 4 years of marriage, she thought she had never seen him at a loss for a response. He was a man of commerce, of negotiation, of the particular masculine fluency of rooms, where men talked and women waited outside them. He moved through language like he moved through contracts with authority, with a forward momentum that discouraged resistance. He had nothing right now. She watched it happen. The collapse of his working assumption that whatever she knew or didn't know, she would be the one at a disadvantage in this room, in this conversation. Because he was the one who had something to confess, and confession in his world came with control of the terms. She had removed the terms. "I don't know what to say to you," he said finally. "Then don't say anything," she replied. She picked up the order sheet again. "When you have something useful to say, I will hear it." He stood. For a moment she thought he was going to leave, and she was already deciding how she felt about that when he said, "He was looking at you like he knew you." She looked up. "Harrington," Nathaniel said. The name came out rough, not polished. "He was looking at you the way a man looks at a woman he's been talking to for years. Not like someone he'd just met." His voice dropped slightly. "And you were talking to him like you'd been waiting to talk to someone like that for a very long time." The silence in the room changed quality. Abigail held his gaze. "We had just met," she said. "We spoke for perhaps 2 hours about land surveys and title disputes and backcountry property law." She paused. "That is what 2 hours of being listened to looks like, Nathaniel. In case you have forgotten." The words landed. She watched them land, watched his face absorb them, the way they moved through his expression, like weather first, the impact of it, and then the slower, worse work of understanding what the impact meant. He sat back down. Not the controlled sitting of a man choosing his moment. He sat down because his legs had simply decided they were finished. "I have not been—" He stopped, restarted. "I know I have not been—" "Don't tell me what you haven't been," she said quietly. "I know what you haven't been. I've been living with the absence of it for 4 years." He left the parlor without having said anything she required him to say, and she let him go because there was nothing in the room for him anymore. No performance of injury, no plea for rapid resolution, no invitation to believe that a single morning's discomfort was sufficient to account for 4 years of being overlooked. She finished the household order. She folded the letters. She took her shawl from the chair by the window and walked out to the back garden. It was already hot, the particular flat still heat of a Charleston July, the kind that settled into the ground and radiated back upward, so that the air between your feet and your face held two separate temperatures. She walked slowly, one hand resting against the swell of her belly, feeling the child shift and resettle with the motion of her steps. She had told no one about the overseer. Not Ruth, not Mrs. Hargrove, not the attorney she kept at a careful distance precisely because he was also Nathaniel's attorney, and she had not yet decided where that line fell. She had gathered the evidence herself, the discrepant weights, the inconsistent labor records, the small but consistent gap between what the low-country property should have been yielding and what it was recorded as having yielded over the past 3 harvests. She had done it methodically over months in the hours before the household woke with the survey maps spread across her working desk and a patience that surprised even herself. She had done it because it needed doing and because she was the one there to do it. She had also done it because she had understood somewhere in the process that if she was going to make any decision about the future of her life, about this marriage, about this child, about the question of what she was willing to accept and what she was not, she needed to understand precisely what she was standing on, what was solid, what was not, what she could carry forward on her own if it came to that, and she could carry quite a lot. That was what the months of work had shown her. Not dramatically. There was no dramatic moment of revelation, no single afternoon where the world rearranged itself. Just the steady accumulation of her own competence documented in the margins of ledgers, and in the spare factual sentences of letters to county offices, and in the quiet mathematics of 3 years of harvest records carefully compared. She was not a woman who required rescue. She required simply acknowledgement. She turned at the garden wall and walked back toward the house, and she thought about Samuel Harrington asking her to continue being presumptuous. And she thought about Nathaniel saying you were talking to him like you'd been waiting to talk to someone like that for a very long time. And she thought about the fact that he was not wrong about that, and that he was also only now understanding it, and that the distance between those two things, between a man being right and a man understanding what his being right meant about his own failures, was the distance she had lived inside for 4 years. She went back to her office. She opened the survey maps. She had work to do. 3 days passed. Nathaniel was present in the house in a way he had not been in over a year. Not present the way she needed him to be. Not the full attending presence of a man who has genuinely arrived somewhere, but physically present, moving through the rooms, appearing at mealtimes, setting down his glass and remaining at the dinner table after the plates were cleared, rather than disappearing into the study by 8 o'clock. She did not reward him for it. She was not unkind. She was never unkind. It was not in her nature, but she did not make it easy for him either, and she recognized that this was its own kind of test. This sustained neutrality of hers, this refusal to either close the distance or mark it. She was not punishing him. She was simply being honest about where she stood, not yet willing to retreat, not yet certain of anything, holding herself in the reasonable center of her own life and waiting to see what he would do with that. On the 3rd morning, he knocked on the door of her office. She had not told him about the office. He had known presumably that the room existed. It was his house. He paid for the desk he had in some distracted way, approved the bookshelf she'd had installed along the east wall. But he had never come to the door. She had never invited him. She hesitated for a moment when she heard the knock, because the office was hers, in a way that the rest of the house was not hers, by occupation, by purpose, by the long private months of work she had done within it. And letting him through that door was different from letting him into the parlor. Then she said, "Come in." He opened the door and stood at the threshold. He looked at the desk, at the maps spread across it, at the ledgers stacked in their careful order on the shelf behind her. He looked at it for a long time. "I didn't know you worked in here," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. He came in. He looked at the map she had been working with, the survey of the low-country property with her notations in the margins, the discrepancies highlighted in the precise, firm lines of her handwriting. "What is this?" he said. "The low-country property," she said. "The harvest records for the past 3 seasons don't match the survey yields." Either the overseer is misreporting the weights, or someone further up the chain is adjusting the numbers after reporting. She picked up the relevant ledger and turned it toward him. I believe it's the overseer. The pattern started the summer he renegotiated his arrangement with your father's estate. He's been taking somewhere between 4 and 6% above his contracted share, which over 3 seasons amounts to. She told him the number. Nathaniel stared at her. Then he looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her again. How long have you known about this? He said. 7 months, she said. I've been documenting it. I didn't have enough to act on until recently. A long pause. A very long pause. The kind that takes up all the air in a room. You found this, he said slowly, in 7 months, without telling anyone. I told you just now, Abigail. He set the ledger down. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face, not the searching look from the banquet, not the stripped-down look from their parlor conversation, but something older than either of them, something that moved across his face like a man finally reading a document he should have read years ago. Why didn't you come to me with this? She held his gaze steadily. Why do you think? The question was not cruel. It was the only honest answer available. He looked down at the ledger. He looked at the maps. He looked, she thought, at the full weight of what was spread across that desk. Not just the overseer's fraud, but the months of solitary work, the early mornings, the careful notations, the absolute self-sufficiency of a woman who had stopped bringing things to her husband because her husband had stopped being somewhere she could bring them. I didn't, he started. I know, she said quietly. I should have, Nathaniel. She folded her hands on the desk. I don't need you to finish those sentences. I've finished them myself many times over. What I need... She paused, choosing the words with care. What I need is for you to understand what those sentences mean. Not just what you didn't do, why you didn't do it, and whether you are capable of doing it differently. The room was very quiet. You don't know if I am, he said. No, she said. I don't. He came back that afternoon with his own copy of the Low Country lease agreement. He set it on the desk beside her maps. He sat in the chair she had placed at the corner of the desk months ago, placed it there for her own use when she needed to spread multiple documents side by side, but it served well enough as a second seat. He did not ask for her permission to sit. He simply sat down, opened the lease, and said, "Walk me through what you found." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned the ledger toward him and began. They worked for 3 hours. She explained the discrepancies. He asked questions. Careful ones, specific ones. The questions of a man who knew commerce and was genuinely following what she was telling him. She showed him the comparison she'd run between the overseer's reporting and the county survey yields. She showed him the pattern in the dates. He leaned forward and looked at the numbers with the particular intensity of a man who is angry on behalf of something he values, and she recognized that the anger was real and that it had at least in part been redirected from the confusion of last night and the morning after towards something more honest, the recognition that while he'd been not seeing his wife had been protecting his property. We can terminate the arrangement with cause, he said. With this documentation we have grounds. Yes, she said. And we should contact the county recorder about the survey data. If there's a formal discrepancy on record, the adjusted weights may have created a tax liability that... I drafted that letter 2 months ago, she said. She reached into the right-hand drawer of the desk and set the letter in front of him. He picked it up. He read it. He set it down. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Abigail, what else have I been missing? The question came out differently than his others. Not the careful, directed questions of a man analyzing a problem. A different kind of question entirely. The kind that doesn't want a list. The kind that is really saying something else underneath the words, something that sounds less like a businessman reviewing his accounts, and more like a man beginning very slowly to understand the size of the thing he has walked into. She looked at him across the desk she had built from her own solitary work, and her own quiet mornings, and her own refusal to disappear just because no one was watching. That, she said, is the right question. She closed the ledger. She straightened the maps. She stood up slowly, one hand moving to her lower back, where the pregnancy was beginning to pull at her in the long afternoons. But it is not a question for today, she said. There's a great deal more than one afternoon can hold. She moved toward the door. Abigail. His voice again. That quiet version of it, the one that had no performance in it. Thank you for the property, for protecting. I protected my child's inheritance, she said. She paused at the door. That's what I did. She looked at him over her shoulder. Whether you are also part of what I'm protecting, that remains to be seen. She left him sitting in her chair at her desk in the office he hadn't known existed, surrounded by 3 years' worth of work he hadn't known she was doing. She went upstairs. She did not look back. The letter from Samuel Harrington arrived 4 days after the banquet. Ruth brought it up on a small silver tray, a little wide-eyed at the unfamiliar handwriting. A good strong hand, she would describe it to the kitchen girl later, not like the loopy letters the merchant sent. Abigail recognized the name on the seal before she broke it. She opened it at her desk alone, with the survey maps moved aside to make room for the small thing it turned out to be. It was brief. A businessman's letter. He made no apologies for its brevity, which she appreciated immediately. He wrote that he had found their conversation the most practically useful he had experienced in recent memory, that he had been in contact with his attorney about the preliminary boundary approach she had suggested, and that the attorney, to Harrington's considerable satisfaction, had confirmed its viability. He wrote that he would be in Charleston for another 2 weeks on other business, and that if she were amenable, he would value the opportunity to continue the conversation about the backcountry property, as there were additional questions his attorney had raised that he suspected she would have more useful answers to than the attorney himself. He signed it S. Harrington, without title, without ceremony. She read it twice. Then she set it on the corner of the desk, in the small, precise rectangle of the morning light, and she held very still for a moment. This was the thing she had to be careful about. This was the thing that required the same accuracy she applied to everything else, the ledgers, the harvest weights, the letters to county offices. Samuel Harrington was not a rescue. He was not a replacement. He was not the corrective to Nathaniel Caldwell in the way that a part of her, the part that had been kept in the dark for 4 years, and that had lit up with the simple oxygen of being heard, wanted him to be. He was a man who had spoken to her honestly. That was all. That was a very small thing, and it should not have felt as large as it did, and the fact that it felt as large as it did was not actually about Samuel Harrington at all. It was about how little of that she had had. She took out a sheet of paper. She dipped her pen. She wrote back. A businesswoman's letter, brief, direct, accurate. She confirmed that she was amenable to continuing the conversation. She suggested Thursday morning at the Hargrove house, where Mrs. Hargrove had standing permission for small, informal meetings regarding the area land associations, which would keep the conversation appropriately public and appropriately purposeful. She did not mention Nathaniel. She did not need to. The meeting was about land surveys. She was capable of meeting with a man about land surveys. She sealed the letter and set it for Ruth to send. Then she opened the Low Country ledger and went back to work. Nathaniel found the Harrington letter. Not by snooping, she was certain of that, or as certain as she could be, because it had been sitting plainly on the corner of her desk when he came to the office that afternoon to look at the factor's response to the Georgetown discrepancy she had flagged for him. He would have had to be deliberately not seeing to have missed it. He did not pick it up, but he saw it. She watched him see it, the brief check of his gaze, the deliberately even return to the factor's letter in his hand, the slight shift in his shoulders. He said nothing. She said nothing. They continued working. An hour later, when the factor's letter had been analyzed and a response drafted, and Nathaniel was collecting his coat from the back of the chair, he said without looking at her, "You're responding to Harrington." "Yes," she said. A pause. "About the land survey." "About the land survey?" Another pause. She could hear him deciding whether to say the next thing. She waited. "Is that all it is?" he said. She set down her pen. She turned in her chair to look at him directly. He was looking at her now, too. That stripped-down look, the one that was becoming familiar, the one that she was beginning to understand, was the closest thing to honest that Nathaniel Caldwell had ever worn on his face. "Yes," she said. "That is all it is." She held his gaze. "But I want you to understand something, Nathaniel. Whether or not that remains all it is has nothing to do with Samuel Harrington. It has everything to do with you." He stood very still. "That is the situation you are in," she said, and her voice was quiet and even, and carried every ounce of the accuracy she had been building for 4 years. "Not because I set out to put you there, but because you built it piece by piece for 4 years, and last week you walked into a banquet and finally saw what you'd built." She picked up her pen again. "You asked me what else you've been missing. That is still the right question. But the answer to that question is not the conversation. It is everything that comes after it." He put on his coat. He moved toward the door. He stopped. "The child," he said, still not looking at her, his hand on the doorframe. I want to be there. I should have already been." "Yes," she said simply. "You should have." He left. She looked at the door for a moment after he closed it. Then she looked at the ledger. Then she picked up her pen and continued working, because the work did not stop for any of this. Not for Nathaniel's dawning understanding. Not for Samuel Harrington's letter on the corner of the desk. Not for the child moving slowly inside her, like something patient and inexorable and entirely sure of its own arrival. The work was hers. The accounting was hers. Whatever this marriage became or didn't become, whatever Nathaniel Caldwell proved himself capable of or failed to prove, the work was always going to be hers. And she had never been afraid of work. Thursday came, the way all consequential days come quietly, without announcement, fitting itself into the shape of an ordinary morning so precisely that you could almost miss the fact that something was about to change. Abigail dressed without hurrying. She chose the gray dress, the practical one, the one she wore when she meant to be taken seriously rather than admired, and she pinned her hair back with the plain tortoiseshell combs her mother had left her. Ruth watched from the doorway, with the particular attentiveness of a girl who understood more than she was supposed to, and she said nothing, and Abigail appreciated her for it. Nathaniel was at breakfast when she came downstairs. He looked up from his coffee. He looked at her dress, at her combs, at the leather document case she carried under her arm, the one she had purchased herself at the stationer's on King Street 3 months ago, because she had needed something to carry papers in, and had simply gone and bought it without asking anyone's permission or opinion. "The Hargrove house," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. He said, "I'll be at the factor's office until midday, if you need me." It was a different sentence than the ones he used to say. The old sentences had been declarations, "I'll be at the factor's office." Statements of his own location offered to no one in particular, requiring nothing back. This sentence had a door in it. A small one, barely large enough to notice. "Thank you," she said. She meant it to land exactly as it landed. Acknowledged, neither warm nor cold, simply received. She left for the Hargrove house with the document case under her arm and the survey notes folded inside it, and the July heat already pressing down on the city like a hand. Cad. Mrs. Hargrove met her at the door herself, which was not the usual arrangement, and told Abigail something about how carefully the woman managed the social geometry of her household. "Mr. Harrington arrived a quarter-hour ago," she said. "I put him in the morning room. Thomas is out, so you'll have privacy, though of course the door stays open." She said the last part without apology, which was the correct way to say it. "Of course," Abigail said. Samuel Harrington stood when she came in, which she had expected. He was a man with manners. She had established that at the banquet. What she had not expected, or perhaps had not fully registered at the banquet, because she had been occupied with managing the triple weight of Nathaniel's presence, and Catherine Voss, and the conversation itself, was the quality of his stillness. He was a large man, but he carried his size without effort, without display, the way certain men carry it when they have stopped needing to prove anything with it. He nodded that same small, genuine nod from the banquet and waited for her to set her case on the table before he sat back down. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I appreciate you making time." "You had useful questions," she said. "That's reason enough." She opened the case and took out the survey notes. "Your attorney confirmed the preliminary boundary approach." "He did." Samuel pulled a folded document from inside his coat and set it on the table. "He also raised a complication I wasn't anticipating. The adjacent landowner, a man named Pruitt, has a standing lien against the property from a disputed sale in 1814. If we approach Pruitt directly for a boundary acknowledgement, he may use the conversation to reopen the lien question before we've resolved it." Abigail looked at the document. She looked at the relevant clause. She thought for a moment. "Then you don't approach Pruitt first," she said. "You approach the lien holder. Find out whether the lien has been assigned or whether it still sits with the original creditor from the 1814 transaction. If it's been assigned, which liens of that age often are, and usually at a fraction of the original value, you can retire it quietly before you ever speak to Pruitt. Remove his leverage before he knows you're looking." Samuel looked at her. "That's not what my attorney suggested." "What did your attorney suggest?" "He suggested I wait." "For what?" "He wasn't specific about that." "Then find a different attorney," she said. Samuel held her gaze for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved that same almost smile from the banquet. "You say that with a great deal of confidence." "I say it because an attorney who tells you to wait without specifying what you're waiting for is either uncertain of the answer or protecting an interest that isn't yours." She turned the document toward him and indicated the clause. "Read this language. This lien is 3 years past its original maturity date. The creditor has almost certainly sold it. Someone is holding a debt instrument that has been earning nothing for 3 years and would accept settlement at 50 cents on the dollar just to have it off their books." Samuel read the clause. He looked up. "How do you know that?" "Because my father was a merchant," she said. "And he sold distressed paper when he needed liquidity and bought it when he had it. I've watched this transaction from both sides." She folded her hands on the table. "The lien is not the problem. The lien is the opportunity." Silence stretched across the morning room. Not an uncomfortable silence, the working kind, the kind that comes after something has been said that is worth sitting with. "Mrs. Caldwell," Samuel said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll forgive the directness." "I prefer it," she said. "Are you available for a consulting engagement?" He held up a hand briefly. "I don't ask lightly, and I understand there are social complications in the question. But I have been trying to resolve this property situation for 8 months through 2 attorneys and a land agent. And in the combined time of 2 conversations with you, I have more practical direction than I have received from any of them." He paused. "I would compensate you properly, in writing, at a rate appropriate for the expertise." Abigail was quiet for a moment. She had not anticipated this. She had prepared for the survey questions. She had not prepared for the conversation to move here to this particular offer, sitting on the table between them in a morning room in Charleston, with the door open and Mrs. Hargrove somewhere in the next room being strategically audible. "I would need to consider it," she said carefully. "Of course." He did not press. "I mention it because I leave Charleston in 9 days, and I suspect whatever I can learn from you in those 9 days would be worth more than what I'd accomplish in the following 3 months with the people I currently have advising me." She looked at the survey notes. She looked at the lien clause. She thought about the document case she had bought for herself at the stationer's on King Street, and the desk she had installed in the back room, and the 7 months of work that nobody had asked her to do, and that she had done anyway because the work existed and she was there to do it. "Come back Thursday week," she said. "I will have an answer by then, and I'll have looked at the lien history in the county records." She gathered the papers into the case. "If the lien is as I expect it to be, you'll have a resolution path before you leave Charleston." "Thank you," he said. He stood. He offered his hand, not in the social way, not the performative gallantry of a man helping a woman from a chair, but the direct working handshake of one person concluding a business meeting with another. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and treated her hand like the hand of a person who had just said something worth hearing. She had forgotten what that felt like. She had not forgotten in 4 years. She had just stopped expecting it. Nathaniel was home when she returned. He was in the front hallway when she came through the door, not waiting for her, or not only waiting for her, because he had his coat on, as though he had recently returned himself, and there were papers in his hand from the factor's office. But he was there, and she understood by now that Nathaniel being present was no longer the casual accident it had once been. "How was it?" he said. She set the document case on the hall table. "Productive," she said. He looked at the case. He looked at her face. He was doing this more now, this looking, this actual attending, and she noticed it the same way she would have noticed a change in temperature without making anything large of it, simply registering the fact. "He asked me to consult on the property matter," she said. She said it directly because she was not going to manage his feelings about it by withholding information. "I told him I would consider it." Nathaniel went very still. "A paid consulting engagement," she clarified, "documented, about a land title dispute in the backcountry. He's had 2 attorneys and a land agent working on it for 8 months without resolution." She paused. "I identified the solution in 2 conversations." The stillness lasted a long time, long enough that she could track its evolution. The initial response, which was the territorial response, the one that lived in the oldest part of a man who had been raised to believe that his wife was a possession. He maintained, rather than a person who might exceed him. And then beneath that, the slower and more complicated response, the one that was beginning to surface in him with increasing frequency over the past 10 days, the response of a man who was being forced to see something he had refused to see, and who was not entirely sure whether what he was feeling was pride or shame or both at once. "You said yes," he said. "I said I would consider it." "Abigail." He set the papers down on the hall table beside her case. He turned to look at her fully. "I want you to know I'm not going to object to this. I have no right to object to this. I know that." He took a breath. "But I need to tell you that it's difficult." "I know it is," she said. "Not because of what it is," he said quickly. "Not because you're working, not because it's Harrington specifically. Because—" He stopped, pressed his jaw. "Because I am sitting in my own house realizing that my wife has spent 4 years being capable of things I didn't know about for a man I've barely met, and I don't have any right to be angry about it, and I am anyway." He looked at her. "And I don't know what to do with that." Abigail looked at her husband. This was new. This was genuinely new, not the performance of contrition, not the careful management of a man who was accustomed to being right and was momentarily adjusting to the inconvenience of being wrong. This was the real thing, confused and a little raw and entirely without its usual polish. "What you do with it," she said quietly, "is exactly what you're doing. You name it accurately. You don't direct it at me, and you remember that the feeling is the consequence of what you built, not what I did." He was quiet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When did you stop seeing me?" The question moved through the hall like a stone through water. She had been saving it, not strategically, not as a weapon, but because it was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that had to be asked before anything else could be answered honestly. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way he had looked at the discrepancy ledger, with the careful, unwilling attention of a man reading numbers that were going to require him to change something fundamental. "I don't think I ever fully started," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 4 years. She had not expected it to land the way it did, not as relief, because it was not a relief, and not as confirmation of something she'd feared, because she had stopped fearing things she already knew. It landed the way truth lands when it finally arrives after a long wait, heavy and somehow smaller than you expected, because the reality of a thing is always more manageable than the anticipation of it. "No," she said. "I don't think you did either." The letter from the county recorder's office arrived 2 days later. Abigail had it opened and reviewed before breakfast. The lien on Harrington's backcountry property had been assigned twice since 1814, first to a land company in Savannah, then 2 years ago to a private creditor in Columbia, whose name she recognized from a transaction her father had mentioned years before. A small operator, her father had said, with more paper than capital and a chronic need for liquidity. She wrote to the Columbia creditor that same morning. A short, direct letter inquiring about the disposition of the assigned instrument and the creditor's interest in a negotiated settlement. She did not tell Nathaniel about the letter, not because she was hiding it, but because it was business. Her business, the business she had been conducting alone for 2 years and was not yet ready to share the practice of even with a Nathaniel who was trying. There was a difference between allowing him to know what she was doing and inviting him into the way she did it. The first was honesty. The second required trust. And trust, as she had told him, was built in actions, not promises. It was built slowly, and she had not been given any particular reason to rush. The response from the Columbia creditor arrived in 4 days. He was interested in settlement. He named a figure. It was higher than Abigail had estimated, but not unreasonably so, and she wrote back with a counter 30% below his opening that she expected he would meet in the middle. She was right. They settled by letter within a week at a figure that Samuel Harrington, when she told him calculated, would save him more than 3 times the cost against the value of the clear title. "You settled a 3-year-old lien by correspondence," he said, "in 10 days. The creditor needed the liquidity more than the paper," she said. The timing was favorable. He was quiet for a moment. They were at the Hargrove house again, the open door, the morning room, the survey notes spread between them on the table. Outside, the heat was building toward the worst of the day. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it carefully because I mean it carefully." He looked at her directly. "You are one of the most practically intelligent people I have spoken with in 20 years of doing business. And I say that not as a compliment designed to flatter you, but as a simple and accurate statement of fact, because I've learned that compliments that don't cost anything aren't worth very much." Abigail held his gaze. "I say it," he continued, "because I think someone should have said it to you years ago clearly and without qualification, and I suspect no one has." The morning room was very quiet. She had braced for the compliment in the way that women who are rarely complimented learn to brace lightly without making anything of it with a ready deflection. She had not braced for the second part, for the accuracy of the second part. "No," she said after a moment. "Not like that." Then it needed saying. She looked at the survey notes. She straightened one edge of the map. She gathered herself with the same quiet deliberateness she had brought to every other moment in the past 3 weeks that had required more of her than she had expected to give. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just keep being accurate. The world needs more of it." Well, she told Nathaniel about the lien settlement that evening. She told him all of it. The letter to the county recorder, the 2 assignments, the Columbia creditor, the correspondence, the settlement figure, the timeline. She told him, sitting across from him at the dinner table with Ruth, already gone for the evening, and the house settling into its summer quiet around them. He listened without interrupting. All the way through. Without the reflexive insertions of a man who was used to redirecting conversations toward his own expertise, without the yes, but, or the I see though, or any of the other small verbal corrections that had been his habit for years. The tiny adjustments that said, "I am listening, but I am also waiting for the moment to lead." He just listened. When she finished, he said, "How much of this have you been doing without me?" "All of it," she said. He nodded. He looked at his hands. "The low country property," he said. "The Georgetown factor. And now this." "Yes." "Anything else?" She considered. "There's a question about the timber rights on the James River parcel that I haven't fully resolved yet. The deed language is ambiguous, and I haven't found a clear precedent in the county records. I have 2 more places to look." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. "Tell me about the James River parcel," he said. She looked at him. "Tonight, if you're willing." She studied his face. The dinner table was between them, and the candles were burning low, and outside the summer dark pressed against the windows. He looked nothing like the man who had stood in the hall 3 weeks ago, with Catherine Voss 40 feet behind him, and his hand still carrying the memory of her back. He looked tired and certain, and stripped of the particular artificial brightness that powerful men wear when they are performing their power. He looked, she thought, like someone who was beginning the long, genuine work of becoming someone worth being. She reached across the table and pulled the bread basket toward her. She broke a piece from the loaf. She settled back in her chair. "The deed was drafted in 1798, she said, by my father-in-law's attorney, who had a habit of using the word appurtenant in contexts where he didn't fully understand what it bound." For the first time in 4 years, Nathaniel Caldwell laughed at something his wife said. Not politely. Not the social laugh of a man managing a room. The actual laugh surprised out of him, brief and genuine. It was such a small thing. And it was the longest distance they had traveled in 4 years. The consulting agreement with Samuel Harrington was drafted on a Thursday and signed on a Friday. Abigail had written it herself, a clean, precise document that specified the scope, the compensation, the timeline, and the nature of the arrangement, which was professional and nothing else. Samuel had read it and made one minor addition to the payment clause and signed it without commentary, which was exactly what you did when an agreement was well drafted. Nathaniel had read it too. She had shown it to him. Not to ask permission, that era was concluded, and they both understood it, even if neither had explicitly said so, but because showing him was part of what she was building. The careful architecture of a different kind of marriage than the one they had had. One built on something real. He had read it twice. He had handed it back to her. He had said, "The indemnification clause is good. I wouldn't have thought to include it." "My father taught me," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He handed it back. She signed it that afternoon. But the thing that happened 3 days before the signing was the thing she had not anticipated. The thing that cracked open the careful equilibrium she had been maintaining and forced her to stand finally in the full center of what was happening, not at the edges of it, not managing it from a working distance, but in it completely. Nathaniel came to her office. Not in the careful way of the past week, not with papers in hand or a question prepared. He came in and he sat down in the corner chair, and he did not say anything for a long moment, and when she looked up from the ledger, she could see immediately that something had shifted in him in a way that the previous week's shifts had not. "I ended it," he said. She set down her pen. "I spoke to Catherine 3 days ago," he said. "It's finished. I told her clearly and without—" He stopped. "Without making promises. I can't keep her excuses that aren't true. I told her it was finished." Abigail's heart did something complicated that she was not going to perform for him. She held very still. "I'm not telling you this to earn something," he said. "I know it doesn't earn anything. I know it's what I should have done before any of this. I know—" He stopped again, and she could see him choosing the words with care, or rather with the absence of care, not managing the words but simply using them. "I know that ending it now is not the same as never having started it, and that you have been carrying 11 months of knowing while I was—" He set his jaw. "While I was deciding I didn't need to account for what I was doing." "Yes," she said quietly. "I am telling you because you deserve to know," he said. "And because I am not interested in—" He looked at her directly, in half measures. "I was only ever good at those. I want to try something different." "Something different is harder," she said. "I know. It's slower." "I know, and I cannot promise you where it leads," she said. "I cannot promise you that what you do now is sufficient to build what we didn't build before. I don't know yet. I am being honest with you about not knowing." "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" she said. Not unkindly, simply with the accuracy she brought to everything. Because the version of you that existed 3 weeks ago would not have understood it. That version would have expected the confession to function as the resolution, the admission to end the accounting. She held his gaze. "I need to know that you understand it is not." He looked at her for a long time. long enough that the heat of the day pressed through the window and the house ticked around them in its summer sounds. And the child between them, the one she was carrying, the one who did not yet have a face, moved once quietly, like punctuation. "I understand," he said, "that I have given you no reason to trust that I understand it." He paused. "And that the only thing left available to me is the version of trust you told me about, the kind built in actions." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "Tell me what the action is today. Just today. That's all I'm asking for." Something moved in her chest. Not softness, not yet, not fully. She was not going to lie to herself about the timeline of it. But the movement of something that had been held very still for a very long time, beginning cautiously to consider the possibility of motion. She turned to the desk. She opened the James River deed. "Today," she said, "you can read this and tell me what you think the word appurtenant is doing in the fourth clause." He pulled his chair closer to the desk. He read, and this small, plain, entirely ordinary moment of two people sitting at a desk together, one reading and one waiting in a room that she had built from her own solitude, and that he had finally been permitted to enter. This was the thing that broke the surface of 4 years of carefully contained water, and let in at last the first thin current of air. She did not remark on it. She simply let it be what it was. The work continued. The summer pressed on. And in the quiet office at the back of the house on Trad Street, something that had been broken for a very long time began with the slow and unsentimental patience of real things to consider becoming something else. The deed language on the James River parcel took them 4 evenings to untangle. Nathaniel was not a man who admitted confusion easily, but by the second evening he had stopped pretending he fully understood what appurtenant was doing in the fourth clause, and simply started asking questions, which was more useful to both of them than the performance of comprehension would have been. Abigail answered his questions directly and without condescension, which she recognized required a specific kind of discipline, not the discipline of holding back irritation, because she was not irritated, but the discipline of remembering that his ignorance of this particular area was not a character flaw. It was simply a gap. Gaps could be filled. By the fourth evening, they had a working interpretation of the clause that both of them found defensible, and Abigail drafted a letter to the county land office requesting a clarification ruling on the deed language. Nathaniel read the draft and suggested one revision to the second paragraph, and the revision was good cleaner than what she'd written, and she incorporated it without comment. And he did not make anything of the fact that she had, and that small exchange between them was, she thought, the most functional they had been in 4 years of marriage. Functional was not romantic. She was clear-eyed about that. But it was real, and real was the foundation that had been missing, and you could not build anything permanent on a foundation that wasn't there. Ruth noticed? Of course Ruth noticed. Ruth noticed everything with the particular acuity of someone who spent her days moving through a house that belonged to other people and had learned to read its atmosphere the way sailors read weather. She didn't say anything, but she set 2 cups on the tea tray instead of 1 when she brought it to the office in the afternoons, and she stopped pausing in that barely there way when Abigail asked whether Mr. Caldwell had come home yet. Small things, the kind that don't announce themselves, the kind you only see when you are paying very close attention. The consulting work for Samuel Harrington required her to go to the county land office on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of July to review the recorded deed history on the backcountry parcel in person. She brought the document case and her own notations and spent 2 hours at the records table with the county clerk, a thin, elderly man named Mr. Potts, who had the resigned air of someone who had spent 40 years watching people argue about land they had never seen. She found what she needed. The deed chain was cleaner than she'd expected once the lien was removed from it. 3 conveyances, each properly recorded. No overlapping claims, the survey markers consistent across all 3 transfers. She made her notes. She thanked Mr. Potts. She was walking toward the door when she nearly collided with a man coming through it. She stepped back. He stepped back. They looked at each other. The man's name was Charles Voss, Catherine's brother. She knew him by sight not well, but enough the way you know the peripheral figures in a story you have been living inside without wanting to. He looked at her document case. He looked at her face. Something crossed his expression that was not quite hostility and not quite discomfort. The particular expression of a man who has been associated with something he knows was wrong and is not sure how to stand in front of the person most damaged by it. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Voss?" she said. A pause. Neither of them moved. "I wanted to," he started. He stopped. He looked at her carefully the way people look at someone when they are trying to read how much latitude they have. "I understand my sister and your husband have concluded their association." "Yes," she said. Another pause. He seemed to be deciding something. "I thought you should know," he said finally, "that Catherine understands what she was participating in. She is not a good woman necessarily, but she is not a stupid one. She understood what she was doing and what it cost." He paused again. "That doesn't help you. I know that. I only wanted to say it." Abigail looked at him. She thought about Catherine Voss, not with the hot immediate anger she had felt in the first months of knowing, but with the cooler, more measured assessment that had replaced it. Catherine Voss had been a choice Nathaniel made. Catherine Voss was not the source of the damage. She was a symptom of it. "Thank you for telling me," Abigail said. And she meant it not warmly, not with forgiveness she hadn't yet found her way to, but with the genuine recognition that the man had said something that cost him something and that it mattered enough to acknowledge. She stepped past him and went out into the July heat. She did not look back, but her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. 3 months ago they would not have been. Something had settled in her that the months of work and the confrontations and the careful measured progress of the past weeks had settled, and she recognized it for what it was, not the settling of grief, not the resignation of a woman who has accepted less than she deserves. The settling of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth and has decided deliberately what she is going to do about it. "Jetty," she told Nathaniel about the encounter that evening. They were in the office. It had become the place they worked together. Now the shared desk, the 2 chairs, the surveys and letters organized into separate but adjacent stacks. She told him plainly, without softening and without emphasis, simply as a piece of information he should have. He was quiet for a moment. "What did you say to him?" "I thanked him," she said. He looked at her. "You thanked Charles Voss." "He said something honest that was difficult to say," she said. "That deserves acknowledgement." Nathaniel turned this over for a moment. She watched him turn it over, watched the initial response, which was the complicated response, and then the slower response that was becoming more familiar in him, the one that was learning to sit with the truth of a thing, rather than immediately doing something with it. "You are a better person than I have been," he said quietly. "I'm an accurately calibrated person," she said. "That's different." She looked at him. "I don't give you that as comfort, Nathaniel. I give it to you because it's the distinction that matters. I'm not better than you. I've simply had 4 years of being required to be very precise about what is real and what I want it to be. Because I wasn't here. Because you weren't here." The words sat between them. Not as accusation. They were past accusation, both of them. The accusatory phase had lasted about 3 days, and then exhausted itself against the greater weight of what actually needed to be done. But as fact, the kind of fact that you put on the table and leave there because covering it up accomplishes nothing. Nathaniel said, "What do you need from me? Not what I think you need. What you actually need." She considered the question. She considered it properly because it deserved a proper answer and because he was finally asking it in the right way, not as a performance of solicitude, not as a man who expected the answer to be manageable, but as a man genuinely waiting to hear something he might not be ready for. "I need you to be present," she said. "Not occasionally, consistently. When you come home, I need you to come home, not to be in the house while your mind is somewhere else." She paused. "I need you to know what is happening with our child. Not the general fact of it. The specifics. What the physician said last week. What I am afraid of and what I am not. I need you to ask." "What did the physician say last week?" he said immediately. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "He said the position is correct and the heartbeat is strong," she said. "He said I should not ride for the rest of the summer and should limit stairs where possible. He said the birth will likely be in November." She paused. "He said first births are often slower and that I should not be frightened if it takes time." "Are you frightened?" he said. She thought about the honest answer. "Sometimes," she said. "In the night. Not about the birth itself, but about what comes after. What kind of world we are giving this child." Nathaniel looked at her directly. "I want it to be a better one than the one I've been building," he said. It was not a polished sentence. It had no rhetorical flourish in it. It was simply the statement of a man who had arrived somewhere true and was saying where he was. "Then we are working on the same thing," she said. The completed report on the Harrington backcountry parcel was ready 12 days after the consulting agreement was signed. Abigail had done it properly, not a brief summary, but a full title analysis, with supporting documentation, the lien retirement certificate, the deed chain. Her interpretation of the ambiguous survey language, and a recommended approach for the preliminary boundary acknowledgement with Prewitt that would hold up to legal scrutiny when the formal survey was eventually completed. It was 40 pages of clean, organized work, and she felt about it the way her father had taught her to feel about good work. Not pride exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that what you have made is accurate. She sent it by messenger to Samuel Harrington's temporary address in Charleston. His response came the same afternoon, a short note that said, "This is exceptional. I am in your debt. If you are ever in need of a professional reference or have interest in expanding this work beyond the Caldwell household, please do not hesitate to call on me. S.H." She read the note twice. Then she folded it and put it in the right-hand drawer of her desk, beneath the letter from the Columbia creditor in the drawer where she kept things she wanted to think about slowly. Nathaniel asked that evening how the Harrington report had been received. She told him what Harrington had written. She told him about the offer of a professional reference. She watched his face, and she did not look away from what moved through it, the complicated thing, the pride and difficulty thing, because she had decided she was not going to make that easier for him by looking elsewhere. He needed to sit with it. It was part of the work. He said, "Are you thinking about it?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "What would it look like," he said, "if you did?" It was, she thought, possibly the most significant question he had asked in their entire marriage. Not should you, or will it affect the household, or any of the other questions that would have been about his own calculations. What would it look like? An invitation to describe something as she saw it on her own terms. "I don't know exactly," she said. "But I think it would mean more consulting work. With other landowners, perhaps. Through Harrington's connections, or through the county land office, Mr. Potts mentioned that there are deed disputes that go unresolved for years, because no one who understands the records is willing to do the work of reading them." She paused. "There is need for it, and I am well positioned to meet it." "You are," he said simply. She looked at him. "You are," he said again, as though he wanted to be certain she had heard it. "And I should have been telling you that for years." The dinner party was Mrs. Hargrove's idea. She proposed it 2 weeks after the banquet, a smaller gathering. 12 people, the kind of dinner that operated as a social ecosystem, distinct from the large formal events where the actual conversations happened and the actual positions of people in relation to one another became clear. She asked Abigail directly at a brief morning call, with the particular straightforwardness of a woman who had decided she was no longer going to pretend not to know what she knew. "I want you there," Mrs. Hargrove said. "Both of you, if Nathaniel is amenable. People have been talking, Abigail, and I'd rather they talk about what they actually see than about what they imagine." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "What are they saying?" "Various things," Mrs. Hargrove said with the deliberate vagueness of someone who was choosing not to repeat the specific versions. "Most of it centers on the Voss situation, which people know about more than they let on, and on Samuel Harrington, which people have made considerably more of than there is to make. There is very little to make of Samuel Harrington, Abigail said. I know that and you know that, Mrs. Hargrove said, but Charleston society is not in the habit of letting accuracy interfere with a good story. She looked at Abigail steadily. Come to dinner, with your husband. Let them see what they actually see. Abigail thought about it for 2 days. She thought about what it meant to walk back into a room with Nathaniel. Not the private rooms, the office and the hall and the dinner table where they had been doing the real work, but the social room. The room with witnesses. The room where the version of them that other people carried around in their heads would be available for revision or confirmation. She thought about what she wanted people to see. She wanted them to see what was true. Not the performance of a repaired marriage, not the careful staging of a reconciliation designed for an audience. She wanted them to see two people who were working on something honest, because that was what it actually was, and she was not willing to represent it as anything more or less. She told Nathaniel about the dinner. He listened. He did not tell her what to decide. He asked what she wanted to do. She told him she wanted to go, and he said then they would go, and that was the whole of the conversation. The night of the Hargrove dinner arrived on a Thursday 3 weeks after the banquet that had begun all of this. Abigail dressed again with care. Not the pale gold gown this time. That dress had already done its work, had already been part of a night that changed the shape of things, and it did not need to do it again. She wore deep blue, which her mother had always said was her color, and she left her hair simpler than usual, and she did not perform anything in the mirror. She simply looked at herself until she felt ready, and then she went downstairs. Nathaniel was waiting in the hall. He was dressed well, and he was on time, both of which had not always been true, and were now in the accounting she was keeping, being tallied alongside all the other small daily evidences of a man trying to do something differently. He looked at her when she came downstairs, and something in his face shifted in a way that was not performed. A genuine response, involuntary, the kind that arrives before a man has time to decide what to do with it. You look, he started. Ready, she said. Yes, he said. You do. He offered her his arm. She took it. They went out. The Hargrove dinner table held exactly the people Mrs. Hargrove had promised, 12. The functional Charleston social circle, the people who shaped what other people believed and repeated and decided. There were 2 attorneys, one of whom was the man who had handled Nathaniel's business for 6 years. There were 2 merchants with interests that overlapped with the Caldwell Low Country property. There was a judge whose wife was Mrs. Hargrove's oldest friend. And at the far end of the table, placed with the deliberateness that characterized everything Mrs. Hargrove did, was Samuel Harrington. Abigail had known he would be there. She had assumed it when Mrs. Hargrove mentioned the dinner, and the assumption had been confirmed when she recognized Mrs. Hargrove's organizing logic. She was not simply giving Abigail an opportunity to be seen. She was giving her an opportunity to be seen accurately in full context with all the relevant parties present and observable. She appreciated the precision of it. She greeted Samuel Harrington at the table with the same directness she brought to everything. A nod, a brief exchange about the title report, a mention that Mr. Potts at the county office had asked her to convey his regards, which made Harrington smile with genuine amusement. Then she took her seat and Nathaniel took his, beside her, and dinner began. Nathaniel spoke to the table that evening. He had always been good at it. The ease of a man in his natural element, the commerce and the conversation and the particular social fluency that came from decades of knowing how to be in a room. But tonight, he was different. He was present in a way that was new, not performing for the table, but they're actually engaging, actually listening when other people spoke. He turned to her twice during the meal to include her in a conversation that she might otherwise have been left outside of. He referred to her work on the Low Country property in a context where it was completely natural and not performed. Mentioned it to the Georgetown merchant as a straightforward fact. My wife identified the discrepancy in the summer accounts. She's been managing the land analysis without the stiff quality of a man who is making himself say something difficult. She watched him do it. She noted it in the private ledger she kept in her own chest, the one where she was carefully recording whether the man across from her was becoming someone she could trust. She noted it without making anything visible of it, because that too was part of the work, holding the evidence clearly without rushing the conclusion it would eventually support. Samuel Harrington watched Nathaniel do it too. He caught Abigail's eye once briefly across the table, not with anything loaded in it, not with the knowing look of a man who believed he had some claim on the story. Simply with the direct, brief recognition of someone who had seen something worth seeing. She looked back to her dinner. After the meal, when the table broke and the guests dispersed toward the garden and the parlor, Samuel Harrington found a moment to speak to her briefly and without orchestration. The title report was the finest piece of land analysis I've received in 20 years of dealing in property, he said. I mean that as a professional statement, not a courtesy. I know you do, she said. That's why I take it seriously. He nodded. Are you going to expand the work? I'm considering it, she said. Don't consider it too long, he said. The people who need what you do don't know yet to look for it, but they will once the word begins to spread. He paused. And it has begun. I told 2 men tonight about the lien settlement. Both of them will be calling on you. Abigail looked at him. You moved quickly. You earned it quickly, he said simply. He tipped his head, that same hat-in-hand nod from the banquet, the one that treated her like a person worth acknowledging, and moved back toward the other guests. She stood for a moment in the quiet margin between the parlor and the garden, holding what he'd said. 2 men will be calling on you. The words settled into her chest and sat there with a weight that was not anxiety and not exhilaration, but something more stable than either recognition. The recognition that the work she had done alone in the early mornings in the back room, in the margins of ledgers she wasn't asked to review, had become something visible, had crossed the threshold from private competence to public fact. She was no longer a woman whose capabilities existed only in the spaces where no one was watching. Someone was watching now. Several someones. And what they saw was accurate. Nathaniel found her in the garden a few minutes later. He came and stood beside her without asking whether she wanted company, which was the correct instinct. She did want it, but what she wanted more was for him to read that correctly, and he had. Harrington spoke to you, he said. He told me 2 of the men at dinner tonight will be seeking consulting work, she said. A pause. She felt Nathaniel take that in. She did not look at his face. She looked at the garden, at the small oil lamps along the paths, at the other guests moving between them. That's going to change things, he said. Yes, she said. For you. Professionally. Yes. Another pause. For us, he said. It was not a question exactly. More of an honest statement of the thing that was true. Probably, she said. Good, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the garden. His profile was familiar. 4 years of marriage meant she knew his face as well as she knew any landscape she'd ever studied, every line and angle of it mapped by long acquaintance. But the expression on it was not familiar. Or rather, it was the expression she had always thought he might be capable of if he ever stopped performing and simply arrived somewhere. It was the expression of a man who meant what he said and did not require applause for meaning it. I am not going to manage this for you, he said. I want you to understand that. I'm not going to position myself as the person who introduces you or oversees the arrangements or explains your work to other men, because I think they need it explained through me. He paused. That is what I would have done a year ago. I'm not going to do it. She held his gaze. What are you going to do? He thought for a moment. Be useful, he said finally. When you want me to be. In whatever way that actually means, not the way I decide it means. He paused again. And come home when I say I will. It was not a dramatic declaration. It did not ask anything of her. It simply said what it said quietly in the garden of the Hargrove house, with the summer heat finally beginning to ease towards something bearable. She looked at him for a long time. That's a start, she said. Not forgiveness. Not yet. They both understood that, and they were both finally being accurate about where they stood. But the first honest sentence of a different kind of accounting. One she was willing provisionally carefully, with both eyes open, to begin keeping. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked back toward the light together, and the distance between them was not gone. She was honest enough to know it was still there. Would be there for some time, would require the slow and unglamorous work of days and weeks and ordinary mornings to close. But it was a different kind of distance than it had been 3 weeks ago. That distance had been absence, had been the space left by someone who had stopped looking. This distance was the distance between two people who were finally facing the same direction. The first of the two men Samuel Harrington had mentioned came to call on a Monday. His name was Edward Marsh, a landowner with holdings east of Columbia, referred to her by Harrington, with a brief note that said simply, "Mrs. Caldwell is the person you need. I suggest you trust her on the first meeting, rather than waiting for the second, as I wasted a meeting by not doing so." Edward Marsh was a practical man in his 50s, with a deed dispute that had been unresolved for 6 years, and a level of frustration about it that was almost physical in the room. He sat across from her desk, took in the maps and the ledgers, with the appraising look of a man who has been disappointed by experts before, and has adjusted his expectations accordingly, and he said, "Harrington says you settled a 3-year lien by letter in 10 days. "Yes," she said. "Harrington is not a man who exaggerates." "No," she agreed. "He is not." Mr. Marsh set his own papers on the desk. "Then let me show you what 6 years looks like," he said, "and you can tell me what you think." She pulled the papers toward her. She read. By the end of the hour, she had identified 3 separate procedural errors in how the dispute had been filed. A recording gap that had been overlooked by 2 previous attorneys, and a chain of title issue that once corrected would likely resolve the core question without requiring the litigation that had been consuming Marsh's time and resources for the better part of a decade. He stared at her when she laid it out. Not the dismissive stare of a man deciding whether to believe a woman. The stare of a man confronting information that genuinely surprises him. "My attorneys missed all of that," he said. "Your attorneys were looking for a legal argument," she said. "I was looking at the record." She turned the deed toward him. "The argument is in the record. You don't need to construct one." He leaned back. He looked at her. He looked at the survey on the desk. He looked at the case she'd made, the clean, documented, entirely followable case. And then he said, "What do you charge for this kind of work, Mrs. Caldwell?" She told him. He agreed to her terms without negotiation, which was the correct response to a fair price, and which she noted with quiet satisfaction. After he left, she sat at her desk for a moment in the particular stillness that follows the completion of something. Not rest. Rest would come later. Simply the moment of being aware that the shape of her life had changed, was actively changing in a direction she had always been capable of, and had simply not been permitted to move in. She was permitted now, not by Nathaniel, or not only by Nathaniel, not primarily, by herself. The permission had always been available to her. She had simply required the catalyst of being unseen long enough that she had finally stopped waiting for someone else to do the seeing. She opened the ledger to a fresh page. She wrote Edward Marsh's name at the top. She wrote the date. She wrote the engagement terms. She began. The evening that changed the final shape of things came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the child was due. Nathaniel had come home by 5 o'clock. He was consistently home by 5 now, which was the specific commitment he had made and the specific one he kept, and she marked it in the private ledger without comment. Because that was how real accounting worked. You marked the accurate thing and let it accumulate. He came directly to the office, which was habit now, the two of them in the shared space in the late afternoon, the work comfortable between them. He was reading through the Marsh correspondence when she said without preamble, "I want to make the consulting work a formal arrangement." He looked up. "Not just individual cases," she said. A formal arrangement, a recognized practice with documented terms operating out of this office. I want it separate from the Caldwell household accounts, my own ledger, my own client correspondence. I want it to be mine clearly and in writing. Nathaniel set down the Marsh letter. He looked at her. She held his gaze, and she did not make it easier for him. She had stopped making things easier for him when they did not need to be, because the work between them required honesty more than it required comfort. "You're saying you want it to be independent of me," he said. "Yes," she said, "even though we're married." "Especially because we're married," she said. "Because if it is mine clearly and indisputably mine, then what I bring to this marriage is mine to choose to bring. Not something you have access to by virtue of ownership." She paused. "And what you bring to me if you choose to is also a choice, not an obligation, not a default." She looked at him steadily. "I want us both to be choosing." The room was very quiet. He looked at his hands. He looked at the desk between them. Her desk, the desk he had come to inhabit as a guest and gradually become a participant in, but which had always been hers, and which they both understood would remain so. "I'll speak to the attorney tomorrow," he said. "We'll have the arrangement structured properly by the end of the week." She looked at him. "You're not going to argue with me?" "No," he said. 3 months ago you would have." 3 months ago, he said, "I was a man who thought that what belonged to his wife was his by extension. I understand now that I was wrong about that." He met her eyes. "I'm not going to pretend that understanding doesn't cost me something, because you asked me for honesty. It does. But the cost of being wrong about it is considerably higher, and I have already paid most of that cost." He paused. "I would rather stop paying it and start doing something that's worth something." She held his gaze for a long moment. This was the question she had been holding for weeks beneath all the other questions, beneath the work and the conversations, and the gradual accumulating evidence of a man doing the difficult daily labor of becoming someone different. The question of whether she believed him. Not whether he was trying, she could see that he was trying, and the trying was real. But whether the change was deep enough. Whether it had roots. She looked at him and she thought about her father's voice. A fair accounting never requires anger, Abigail. It simply requires accuracy. And she thought about what was actually in the ledger she'd been keeping. Every evening home by 5. Every question asked genuinely, not performatively. The attorney he had not mentioned but had apparently consulted about Catherine Voss before telling her it was over. She had learned that detail from a second-hand source and had tucked it into the ledger without comment. The revision he had offered to her Georgetown letter. The James River deed, 4 evenings of working through something he didn't understand because she was working through it. His arm at the Hargrove dinner. His restraint about Harrington. What would it look like if you did? She added it up. It did not add up to everything. It was not enough for everything. Trust was not mathematics, and she knew that, and she was not going to let the clean narrative of an accounting replace the messier and more accurate truth that some things took longer than ledgers allowed for. But it added up to enough to say the next thing. "The attorney can structure the formal arrangement," she said, "and when it's in place and the documents are signed, I'd like you to be the first person I tell about the next client." Nathaniel looked at her. Something in his face moved that involuntary thing, the genuine response that arrived before the managed one. "You mean that?" "I mean exactly that," she said. "Not more, not less." She held his gaze. "That is where we are." He nodded. Once slowly. Not with relief would have been the wrong response, and she would have noted it if it had been there. With something more careful and more honest than relief. The acknowledgement of a man who understood that what he had been given was not forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps not fully, but something almost more valuable, a next step. A next, honest step offered by a woman who had every reason not to offer it and had chosen to anyway. "Then that," he said quietly, "is enough." The child moved. A strong rolling movement, the kind she had begun to recognize as the particular announcement of a baby who had opinions about things. She set her hand against it without thinking. Nathaniel saw it. He did not ask permission. He simply moved his chair closer and looked at her with the question in his face, and she looked back with the answer, and he placed his hand beside hers. The room was quiet, and the summer was almost over, and the work between them, all of it, the ledgers and the letters and the slow, unglamorous, entirely real work of two people deciding whether to become something worth being, was not finished. Would not be finished for a very long time. But it had started. Honestly, finally, with both of them in the room. That was the thing that had been missing. And it was, she thought, the only thing that had ever mattered. The formal arrangement was signed on a Friday. Nathaniel had spoken to the attorney, not his own, which Abigail noted and appreciated, but a different one. A man named Garrett, who practiced out of a small office on Broad Street, and had a reputation for drafting documents with more precision than flourish. The papers arrived on Thursday. Abigail read them twice. She made 2 small revisions, sent them back, and received the corrected version by Friday afternoon. She signed her name at the bottom of the page and felt the particular solidity of something becoming real that had previously existed only in the determined space of her own intention. Her practice, her clients, her ledger. Nathaniel signed his portion, the acknowledgement clause, confirming that the arrangement operated independently of the household accounts and that the consulting income was solely hers to direct, without ceremony, without the stiffness of a man performing an act of generosity. He simply signed it, dated it, and handed it back to Garrett's clerk, and the whole thing was done by the time the afternoon light began to angle through the office window. Abigail set the signed document in the right-hand drawer of her desk beside Harrington's note, and the Columbia creditor's letter, and the other small accumulated evidences of a life she had been quietly building while everything else around her was uncertain. Then she looked at Nathaniel across the desk and said, "Edward Marsh's brother-in-law has a timber rights dispute in Virginia. He wrote to me last Tuesday. I think it's resolvable." Nathaniel leaned forward. "Tell me about it." So she did. The child arrived on a Thursday in early November during the first cold rain of the season. It was a boy. Abigail had not expected to have a preference and discovered at the moment he was placed in her arms that she hadn't had one, that what she felt looking at him was entirely without the category of preference, was simply the enormous and slightly terrifying fact of him. This specific person entirely new, with his father's chin and her father's hands, and a voice that announced itself to the whole upper floor of the house on Trad Street with remarkable conviction. Nathaniel was there. He had been there since 2 a.m. when she had woken and known with the particular physical certainty that has nothing to do with reason that the waiting was over. He had done what she had asked of him. In those weeks he had asked her what she needed, rather than deciding it, and she had told him, and he had done it. He had stayed close without hovering, had spoken quietly when she needed voice and said nothing when she did not, had held her hand during the worst of it with the steady pressure of a man who was genuinely there. When the physician placed the boy in his arms, Nathaniel held him for a long moment without speaking. He looked at his son with the expression of a man confronted with something that reorganized everything he had previously understood. Not the careful expression of a man managing his response. The open, unguarded, slightly undone expression of a man being changed by what he was looking at. "James," Abigail said. She had chosen the name weeks ago. James Whitmore Caldwell. Her father's first name carried forward, placed first before the Caldwell that the boy would wear through his life. She had told Nathaniel her choice, and he had said yes, without deliberation, which was the right response, because it was her choice to make. Nathaniel looked at her. "James," he repeated. He said it quietly, like something being recorded. "He'll need an example," she said. Her voice was tired and plain and entirely honest. "Not a performance. An example." Nathaniel looked back at the boy in his arms. "I know," he said. She believed him. Not completely, not yet. Not in the way that would take years to build into something fully solid, but enough. Enough to close her eyes in the gray November morning while her son's voice quieted and the rain came down on Trad Street and the complicated, necessary real work of being a family began. The letter that arrived 3 weeks after James's birth was not from a client. It was from Catherine Voss. Ruth brought it up with the morning correspondence, and Abigail recognized the handwriting on the outside. She had seen it once before, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she held it for a moment before she opened it. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. The anger that had been a faithful companion for so long had quieted in the weeks since James arrived, had settled into something that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, but simply accuracy. Things were what they were. People made choices and lived inside them. She had made choices. Nathaniel had made choices. Catherine Voss had made choices. She opened the letter. It was short. A single page in a hand that had started carefully and then abandoned the carefulness somewhere in the second paragraph and simply said what it said. Catherine Voss did not ask for forgiveness. She was smarter than that, Abigail noted. She knew forgiveness was not hers to ask for. That whatever was between Nathaniel and Abigail was not a debt that a third party could offer to retire. What she said instead was that she understood the nature of what she had participated in, that she had told herself things that were not true in order to participate in it, and that she was not writing to excuse herself or to seek comfort from the person she had wronged. She was writing because she had heard that Abigail had begun a consulting practice, and because she had a deed dispute of her own, the house on Laguerre Street, which she had purchased in her own name from her late husband's estate, and which a distant cousin of her husband's was now contesting, and because she wrote plainly, "I know of no one more qualified to look at this than you, and I did not want cowardice to stop me from asking. You are free to decline. I would understand it completely." Abigail read the letter twice. Then she set it on the corner of the desk in the morning light and looked at it for a very long time. This was not a simple question. She was clear-eyed about that. Consulting for Catherine Voss would be a decision with weight to it, with the particular complexity of something that exists at the intersection of professional and personal in a way that could not be cleanly separated. She was not going to pretend otherwise, but she was also not going to pretend that the question was simply emotional, because it was not. A woman had a deed dispute. The dispute was legitimate. Abigail had the expertise to address it. The woman in question had behaved badly and knew it, and was not asking to be absolved of that, and was not letting the fear of refusal stop her from making the request honestly. There was something in that, something she recognized because she had spent years doing hard things while afraid of the response. She did not make a decision that morning. She filed the letter in the right-hand drawer and went downstairs to feed James, and she let the question sit in the accurate patient space where she kept things that needed more time. She told Nathaniel about the letter that evening. She told him directly without preparation, because there was no version of the conversation that would be improved by preparation. He was reading at the table in the office. They had added a second lamp sometime in September, because they were both in the office in the evenings now, and one lamp was not sufficient, and she handed him the letter and stood at the window while he read it. She heard him exhale. Once short. "She wrote to you," he said. "Yes." "Asking you to take her case?" "Yes." A long pause. She heard him set the letter down on the table. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. She turned from the window. "I want to know what you think." He looked at her. She could see the thing it cost him, not a performance of the cost, but the actual thing, the particular difficulty of a man being asked to weigh in rationally on a situation in which his own conduct was part of the tangled root system. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter. "I think," he said slowly, "that the question of whether you take the case has nothing to do with me, or with Catherine. It has to do with you and what you want your practice to be, and whether the professional merits justify it." He paused. "And I think if I try to tell you what to do about it, I am doing exactly what I told you I was finished doing." She looked at him. "But you want my opinion," he said. "Yes," she said. "Not my instruction, my opinion." He thought. He genuinely thought she could see him working through it, setting aside the parts that were about his own feelings, which was not easy, and arriving at something that was as close to honest as he could get. "She asked you honestly," he said. "She didn't dress it up. She told you what she did and she asked anyway." He paused. "I think you should make the decision on the merits." And I think if you decide to take it, I will not make that harder for you than it already is." He met her eyes. "That's the most I can offer. I'm aware it's not nothing." "It's not nothing," she said. She took the letter back. She put it in the drawer. She sat down at the desk and opened the Marsh file because the Marsh case had a deadline and the morning had been consumed by James and the afternoon by the correspondence, and the work did not pause for any of this. But that night before she slept, she made her decision. She was going to write back to Catherine Voss. She was going to tell her that she would review the deed and the cousin's claim and assess whether there was a legitimate basis for the challenge. She was going to charge her standard rate documented in writing. She was going to do the work with the same accuracy she brought to every case without favor and without its opposite, not because she had forgiven Catherine Voss. She had not fully done that and was not going to lie to herself about the timeline of it. But because the work was the work, and she had decided the shape of her practice months ago in the back room with the survey maps, it would be accurate, it would be fair, and it would not be determined by her feelings about the people who needed it. That was the standard she had set for herself. She was going to keep it. The cousin's challenge to Catherine Voss's deed was, as Abigail had suspected from the letter's description, almost entirely without merit. The house on Legare Street had been purchased outright from the proceeds of the late Mr. Voss's estate, with a properly executed bill of sale and a clear deed recorded in the county office. The cousin's claim rested on a single clause in the original Voss family property agreement from 1802, a clause that appeared on first reading to grant family members a right of first refusal on estate property. On careful reading, which Abigail conducted over the course of 2 days at the county records office, the clause applied only to property that had been specifically entailed to male heirs, which the Legare Street house had never been. The cousin's attorney had either not read the 1802 agreement carefully, or had read it and was betting that no one on the other side would. He had bet wrong. Abigail wrote the analysis in a single evening with Mr. Potts's record copies spread across her desk, and James asleep in the cradle that Nathaniel had moved into the office 3 weeks after the birth, because he had noticed that she worked better when the boy was near. She wrote it with the same clean precision she brought to every document, no excess, no ornamentation. Simply the accurate reading of the record set beside the accurate reading of the claim, with the conclusion made plain. The cousin's claim was groundless. It would not survive a hearing. Any competent judge would dismiss it on the pleadings. She sent the analysis to Catherine Voss with a brief cover letter and her invoice. She did not append anything personal to it. The work spoke entirely for itself. Catherine's response arrived 2 days later. A short note just as direct as the first letter, even plainer. "Thank you. The analysis is clear, and I believe you are correct. I will share this with my attorney and proceed accordingly. I know that doing this was not simple for you. I am grateful." Abigail read it. She set it aside. She opened the next file. By spring of 1818, the practice had 6 active clients. She had not advertised it. There was no mechanism for that, no proper channel for a woman of her position to announce professional services, and she had not needed one. The work had moved through the networks that commercial networks always move through. One person told another, and that person told another, and the quality of the work spoke in a language that did not require her to explain herself. Edward Marsh's brother-in-law. 2 clients from Samuel Harrington's introductions. One from the county land office itself, a referral from Mr. Potts, who had apparently been telling people about the woman who came in and read deed chains the way other people read novels, quickly, completely, and with visible enjoyment. And one from a judge's wife who had heard about the Voss analysis through 3 degrees of Charleston social circulation and had arrived at Abigail's door with a boundary dispute that her husband had told her was unwinnable. It was not unwinnable. It simply required someone willing to read the original 1799 survey and the 1803 amendment together, which no one had apparently done. Abigail won it in 6 weeks. The judge's wife sat across from her desk afterward and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had spent many years being told that certain doors were not for her. "You should have been an attorney," she said. "Attorneys can't do what I do." Abigail said. "They're trained to argue. I'm trained to read." The judge's wife laughed. It was a good laugh, the real kind. "Where did you learn?" "My father taught me to read ledgers," Abigail said. "The law is just a different kind of ledger. Credits and debits. What the record says versus what someone claims it says." She paused. Most disputes exist in the distance between those two things. The judge's wife looked at her for a moment. "My husband has 3 colleagues on the circuit who are dealing with deed disputes they haven't been able to resolve for years," she said. "I'd like to tell them about you." "Please do," Abigail said. Nathaniel came home one evening in April to find her at the desk with 3 files open simultaneously and a 4th stacked on the corner waiting, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the landscape of her work before he came in. "You need help," he said. She looked up. "I need a clerk," she said. "Someone who can manage the correspondence and copy documents. I'm spending 2 hours a day on tasks that don't require my judgment." He sat down. "I'll find someone," he said. "I'll find someone," she corrected. "But if you have names, I'll hear them." He offered 2 names the next morning. She interviewed both. She hired the one she preferred, a young man named Thomas, barely 20, who had been reading law informally in an attorney's office and had more practical sense than anyone twice his age. He started the following Monday, and by the end of the first week, Abigail had recovered the 2 hours a day that had been going to correspondence and redirected them to the Virginia timber case, which had turned out to be considerably more complicated than she had initially assessed, and which she was going to need to resolve before June. The Virginia case was where Samuel Harrington found her in the middle of a Thursday afternoon in late April when he arrived at the house on Trad Street for what turned out to be his final visit to Charleston before returning to his home state for the season. He had sent a note the day before, brief and professional, asking if she had time. She had made time. They sat in the office, Thomas tactfully absent Nathaniel at the factor's office until 5, and Harrington set a new file on the desk. "Another property," she said. "Another property," he confirmed. "In Georgia this time. More complicated than the last." He looked at her steadily. "I'll understand if you're full." "Tell me about it," she said. He told her. She listened. She asked 4 questions, precise ones, and he answered them with the directness that had been consistent in him from the first conversation at the Hargrove banquet. By the end of 20 minutes, she knew what the problem was and had a preliminary sense of how it could be approached. "I'm not full," she said. "Send me the deed history and the survey records when you're back in Georgia." "I will." He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. He looked at her for a moment with the same quiet directness he had brought to every exchange they'd had. "How is the practice?" "Growing," she said. "And the rest?" he said. She understood what he meant. He had always been careful with it, never asking directly, never implying anything that wasn't there, but present enough as a person to be aware that what had been happening in this house on Trad Street was not only about land disputes. "Also growing," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said, simply without elaboration. The word of a man who meant what he said and did not feel the need to decorate it. He stood. He offered his hand. She shook it, that same direct working handshake, person to person, the one that had felt remarkable for its ordinariness the first time, and now felt like simply what it was, how 2 professionals concluded a meeting. "You're going to be the most well-known name in property law in South Carolina within 5 years, he said. "I'd put money on it." "You'd probably win," she said. He put on his hat. He tipped it, the same small, genuine gesture from the first night, the one she had carried around for months as evidence of a thing she had thought she might never have again. He left. She sat at the desk for a moment in the quiet after he'd gone. She thought about the banquet. She thought about the pale gold dress and the lemonade and the 40 feet of distance between herself and Nathaniel's hand on another woman's back, and the entirely accidental conversation that had begun without any of them intending it, the chain of events that had brought her here. She was not grateful for what Nathaniel had done to her. She was not going to arrange the story into the shape of a woman who had needed to be broken in order to be rebuilt, because that story was not accurate, and she was committed to accuracy above all other things. She had not needed to suffer to become what she was. She had been this, always the competence and the intelligence and the capacity for the work had always been there. They had simply been kept in a room with no windows. What she was grateful for was the window. However, it had opened. Nathaniel came home that evening at 5:05. She heard the door, heard his step in the hall, heard him stop at Thomas's small desk in the anteroom and exchange a few words with the young man she had started to recognize. The rhythm of those brief exchanges, Nathaniel quietly learning what the afternoon had held, staying current in a way that was now genuine habit rather than performed effort. Then his step toward the office. He came in and looked at the new file on the corner of the desk. "Harrington," he said. "Georgia property," she said. "More complicated than the last." He sat down. He picked up the corner of the file and looked at the cover page. "You took it." "I took it." He set the file back down. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know best in him over the past months, the one that had no performance in it, that simply registered what was true. "Good," he said. "I also—" She paused not for effect, but because she was choosing the words carefully, because the words mattered. "I've been thinking about something. I want to tell you about it." He waited. "I want to teach," she said. "Not formally, there's no mechanism for formal instruction in this. But there are women in this city whose husbands are involved in land commerce who manage their households the way I was managing ours, who have the intelligence and the capacity to do this work. If someone showed them how to read a deed chain, how to identify a recording gap, how to approach a lien as an opportunity rather than an obstacle." She looked at him directly. "I want to begin meeting with them, informally through Mrs. Hargrove's network. I want to show them what I've learned." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She braced, not with the old bracing the tightening against dismissal, but with the practical bracing of a woman who knows that even the most changed version of a man still has the capacity to surprise her in the wrong direction. "How many women?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "However many want to learn." He nodded slowly. "You'll need more space than the office." She blinked. "What?" "If you're meeting with groups of women, the office is too small," he said. "The front parlor has better light and enough seating for 8 or 10. If you want to use it, it's yours." He paused. "I can take my evening reading somewhere else." She looked at him properly, the way she had looked at the deed chains and the ledgers fully and without the protection of a preformed conclusion. "You're serious," she said. "I'm always serious when I mean something," he said. He met her eyes. "You have been teaching me all winter what it looks like when someone is actually present for the work that matters. I'm trying to apply the lesson." Something moved through her. She did not perform it, she simply let it be what it was in the privacy of her own chest, in the careful space she kept for the things that were true and still becoming. "The front parlor," she said. "The front parlor," he confirmed. She looked at the window. She looked at James's cradle in the corner, the boy asleep with the total conviction of someone who had not yet encountered a single reason to distrust the world. She thought about what kind of world she was building for him. What he would watch, what he would learn, what version of a man and a woman he would grow up believing was possible. She wanted him to see this. This exact thing, not the romance of it, not the grand gesture, but this two people sitting at a desk at the end of a Thursday, doing the real work of becoming something worth being. "Then the first meeting will be in 2 weeks, she said. "I'll write to Mrs. Hargrove tomorrow." "Good," he said. He picked up the Marsh correspondence and began to read, and she opened the Georgia deed file, and the room settled into its working quiet, the two of them in the lamplight, the baby sleeping, the city of Charleston going about its Thursday evening outside the windows. The first meeting in the front parlor drew 7 women. Some of them came because they were curious. Some came because Mrs. Hargrove had a way of extending invitations that made refusal feel like an oversight rather than a decision. One came because her husband's estate was in a boundary dispute that had been costing them money for 3 years, and she had told Mrs. Hargrove that if anyone in Charleston knew what to do about it, she wanted to be introduced. Abigail stood in front of them, without notes. She had not prepared a lecture. She found when she thought about how to begin that the thing she most wanted to say was not a principle or a framework or anything that required a list. It was something simpler. Most of you manage more than you are given credit for, she said. You know this and you do it anyway. What I want to teach you is how to do it with documentation, with legal standing, with the ability to walk into a county office and read the record for yourself, rather than waiting for someone else to read it for you. She paused. That skill has no requirement except patience and a willingness to look closely at things that are written to discourage looking closely. She looked around the room. Every one of you is already doing something harder than reading a deed chain. I promise you this is within your reach. The woman with the boundary dispute spoke first. Where do we start? Abigail picked up a deed from the stack on the parlor table. Here, she said. We start with this. A property record from 1803. I want you to tell me what the fourth clause says, and then I want you to tell me what it actually means. Those are two different questions, and the difference between them is where most disputes live. The room leaned forward. Richest. Nathaniel heard about the meeting from Thomas, who had heard about it from Ruth, who had been carrying tea in and out of the front parlor for 2 hours. He heard that 7 women had sat in his front parlor for the better part of an afternoon, reading deed chains and asking questions that the attorneys of Charleston had been avoiding for years under the instruction of his wife, who had apparently been so completely in command of the room that even Mrs. Hargrove, who was in command of most rooms she entered, had been taking notes. He went to find Abigail after dinner. She was at the office desk already reviewing something for a client James fed and settled for the evening. She looked up when he came in. 7 women, he said. 7, she confirmed. Mrs. Hargrove took notes. She almost smiled. She has better handwriting than most of the attorneys I've met. He leaned against the doorframe. He looked at her. The desk, the files, the document case on the shelf, the cradle in the corner, the woman at the center of all of it, who had been the center of all of it long before he had understood enough to look. I was thinking, he said, about what you said once, about wanting to matter to the person you married. He paused. She had stopped writing, but had not looked up yet. You said you never needed me to be extraordinary. You needed me to be present. She set down her pen. She looked at him. I was thinking, he said, that I've been present every day for 6 months, and I'm still learning what that means, what it actually requires. He came into the room and sat down in the corner chair, his chair the one that had once been hers alone and was now simply theirs. I think it means something different every day. It does, she said. I think I'll be learning it for the rest of my life, he said. Probably, she said. So will I. She held his gaze. That's not a failure, Nathaniel. That's just what it is when you're doing it honestly. He nodded. He looked at James, who had one fist pressed to his cheek in the absolute certainty of sleep. He looked at the desk, at the files, at the practice that had grown from one conversation at a banquet, and 7 months of solitary early mornings, and one woman's unrelenting refusal to become less than she was. I'm proud of you, he said. I want to say that clearly and without qualification, because you told me a long time ago that you had never heard it said that way. He looked at her. I am proud of you. I should have been saying it for years. The lamp flickered in the draft from the hallway. James shifted in the cradle and settled again. Outside, the spring night, pressed against the windows of Trad Street, warm for the first time since October, carrying with it the particular quality of a season that has decided it's finally time. Abigail looked at her husband. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, fully accurately, without the distortion of what she wished, and without the distortion of what she feared. She looked at what was actually there, What was actually there was a man who had caused her real harm and had faced it without flinching away from the full weight of what it meant. A man who had signed a document making her work legally her own, who had offered his front parlor, who had come home by 5 o'clock every day for 6 months without being asked twice, who had placed his hand beside hers in the lamplight and meant it. Not a perfect man, not a remade man, a man who was doing the real work of becoming someone worth being one ordinary, unglamorous, consistently honest day at a time. It was not everything she had wanted at 22 when she had married him, full of the particular hope of a young woman who had not yet learned the precise cost of that hope. It was better than that. It was real. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you are." She picked up her pen. She looked at the file. She looked back at him. "Pull your chair closer," she said. "I want to show you something in the Georgia deed. There's a clause that doesn't make sense yet, and I want another set of eyes." He pulled the chair to the desk. He leaned over the document beside her. Their two heads bent toward the lamplight over the paper, over the work that was hers, and that she was choosing freely, and with full knowledge of what it cost and what it gave back to share with him. This was not the love story she had been promised. It was not the easy love of two young people at the beginning of something unblemished. It was the harder, truer thing, the love that exists on the other side of damage, built not on the absence of pain, but on what two people decide to do with the fact of it. Outside Charleston, moved through its spring evening, unknowing and indifferent, the way cities always are to the small and enormous things that happen in their houses. Inside the office on Trad Street with the lamp burning and the baby sleeping, and the Georgia deed spread between them. Abigail Whitmore Caldwell did what she had always done. She looked closely, she read accurately, she did the work. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not do it alone. That was enough. More than enough. It was in the plain and honest accounting of a woman who had learned to tell the difference exactly what it needed to be.